اذن الهی بر رژیم صهیونیستی واقع خواهد شد، عمل خواهد شد و با اونها مماشاتی نخواهد.
What happens when a regime collapses not from the streets below, but from the rooms above? In Tehran, night no longer brings quiet. Sirens echo through half-lit avenues. Phones vibrate in silence as encrypted messages pass between ministers, clerics, and commanders. Outside crowds chant, inside doors are being locked, and suitcases quietly filled. This is not the familiar image of protest confronting power. It is power confronting itself, fractured and unsure whether tomorrow will come. For years, Iran's leadership treated unrest as a manageable condition. Protests were contained, internet switches were flipped, security forces restored order. But the current wave feels different, not because of its scale alone, but because of where the cracks are appearing. Demonstrations now stretch across most provinces, yet the real shock is the visible hesitation at the top. Clerics break ranks, police units abandon posts, officials disappear from public view. The center is no longer holding. The most destabilizing signal has come from within the regime's own ideological core. When a cleric publicly denounces the system and curses its founders, the message cuts deeper than any foreign sanction or external threat. This is not dissent from the margins, it is apostasy from the inside. In authoritarian systems built on religious legitimacy, such moments are existential. They suggest not just anger, but disbelief and erosion of faith in the very narrative that sustained power for decades. This internal unraveling exposes a widening chasm between Iran's political leadership and its security apparatus. The relationship between clerics and commanders was once symbiotic ideology, justified force, and force-protected ideology. That balance is now strained. Revolutionary Guard commanders are increasingly wary that political elites eager to protect their families and assets may sacrifice them as scapegoats. Trust essential in any coercive system is evaporating. Meanwhile, the streets sense this weakness. Protesters no longer behave like people expecting to be crushed. They move with the confidence of those who believe the fear barrier has been breached. When statues fall and symbols burn without consequence, it sends a powerful signal the regime's protective shield is no longer absolute. Control depends not only on weapons, but on the belief that those weapons will be used. That belief is fading. At the center of this storm stands Ali Khamenei, a figure once portrayed as untouchable, distant, permanent. Now his silence is conspicuous. Rumors replace speeches. Absence replaces authority. In systems like Iran's, uncertainty at the apex travels downward fast. Orders lose clarity. Initiative disappears. Mid-level officials hesitate, unsure which direction power will flow. This is how regimes enter the danger zone, not when protests erupt, but when elites stop believing in their own future. History shows that once those at the top begin planning escape scenarios, the system's cohesion weakens irreversibly. The question is no longer whether the state can suppress unrest. It is whether it still believes suppression will save it. And as Tehran's corridors of power grow quieter, one reality becomes impossible to ignore. This crisis is no longer about reform or repression. It is about survival, and who in the end is willing to stand and fight for a system that may already be preparing to run. The most revealing movements in Tehran are no longer happening in the streets, but behind closed doors, in visa offices, private airports, and guarded villas in the city's northern districts. While crowds chant for change, a quieter panic is unfolding among those who once preached defiance of the West. According to multiple intelligence-linked reports circulating in European media, families tied to Iran's political elite are seeking exit routes fast. Applications for residency, asylum pathways, and long-term visas to Europe have surged. This is not rumor as gossip, it is rumor as pattern. What makes this moment explosive is not simply that elites are hedging their bets. Authoritarian systems often do that. What makes it dangerous is the hypocrisy it exposes. For decades, the regime framed Europe and the United States as decadent enemies. Now those same capitals are being quietly approached as lifeboats. The contradiction is not lost on the Iranian public or on the security forces ordered to hold the line. Among the names reportedly circulating are relatives linked to Hassan Rouhani, once marketed as the regime's moderate face, and figures connected to Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, a pillar of the conservative establishment. These are not fringe actors. They represent the managerial class of the Islamic Republic, the technocrats and power brokers who kept the system running. Their families' sudden interest in European safe havens signals a loss of confidence at the very heart of governance. This elite flight is corroding internal cohesion. Within the revolutionary Revolutionary Guards and police units, resentment is building. Commanders see politicians preparing escape routes, while rank-and-file officers struggle with unpaid salaries and rising food prices. The message received in the barracks is brutal. If things collapse, responsibility will fall on those holding weapons, not those holding passports. That perception alone can paralyze a security response. Reports of abandoned police stations in provincial towns reinforce this picture. In some areas, officers have reportedly removed uniforms and melted back into civilian life. This is not mass defection, but it is selective withdrawal. And in fragile systems, selective withdrawal is often the prelude to systemic failure. A state can survive protests, it struggles to survive indifference from its own enforcers. Internationally, these developments are being watched with unease. European governments face an uncomfortable paradox. The same regime figures who denounce Western values may soon seek protection under them. Quiet contingency planning is underway, even as officials publicly stress non-interference. No one wants to be seen as facilitating an elite escape, but no one wants chaos either. The optics are devastating inside Iran. Protesters see a ruling class preparing to flee while urging sacrifice from the population. Every leaked visa application, every rumor of a family relocated abroad sharpens the sense of betrayal. Revolutions are not driven only by anger. They are driven by the belief that those in power no longer believe in themselves. As suitcases close in Tehran's wealthiest neighborhoods, a question spreads through the streets and the ranks alike. If the architects of the system are planning an exit, who exactly is expected to defend it and why? When fear collapses, symbols fall first. Across multiple Iranian cities, images circulate of monuments, defaced posters burned, and once untouchable icons reduced to rubble. These are not random acts of vandalism. They are messages. In authoritarian systems, symbols are not decoration, they are enforcement. They remind citizens who is watching, who is protected, who cannot be challenged. When those symbols are attacked without immediate retaliation, the psychological balance shifts decisively. Among the most striking targets are statues and murals honoring Qasem Soleimani, long elevated as the embodiment of national strength and external reach. For years, his image was carefully curated as sacred, omnipresent, and immune. The failure to defend these monuments now speaks louder than their destruction. It suggests hesitation within the security forces tasked with guarding them, or worse, indifference. Either interpretation is corrosive to authority. At the same time, clerical dissent has moved from whispers to screens. Videos allegedly showing religious figures denouncing the regime's leadership have spread rapidly online. Even where authenticity cannot be independently verified, the impact is real. In systems built on religious legitimacy, the appearance of internal theological rebellion undermines the regime's claim to moral monopoly. It reframes dissent not as heresy, but as conscience. This erosion of ideological control is compounded by the regime's uneven response. In some cities, protests are met with force. In others, there is a conspicuous absence of enforcement. Such inconsistency fuels momentum. Protesters learn where the lines are thin, where authority hesitates, where the state's reach ends. Each unchallenged act emboldens the next. The broader strategic implication is clear deterrence is failing. Power relies not only on the capacity to punish, but on the expectation that punishment will follow defiance. Once that expectation weakens, repression becomes costlier and less effective. Every deployment risks escalation. Every crackdown risks defections. The state is forced into reactive mode. International parallels are unavoidable. In Ukraine, the early stages of resistance were defined not only by battlefield engagements, but by the rapid delegitimization of occupying symbols. In the Middle East, from Cairo to Damascus, regimes learned that when portraits fall and slogans change, authority erodes faster than tanks can respond. Iran now appears to be entering that same psychological phase. The human dimension matters here. Many security personnel are not ideologues. They are employees in a collapsing economy. When ordered to defend symbols that no longer command respect while their own families face shortages, loyalty becomes transactional and fragile. The chain of command weakens not through mutiny, but through hesitation. What is unfolding is not yet a revolution. States can survive iconoclasm, but they cannot survive the loss of belief among those tasked with enforcing order. When statues fall, they mark the moment fear stops working. From there, control must rely solely on force, and force alone rarely holds indefinitely. As Iran's streets rewrite the meaning of power, the regime confronts a dangerous truth. Symbols once designed to intimidate are now rallying points for defiance. And once that transformation occurs, reclaiming psychological dominance becomes exponentially harder. History rarely repeats itself cleanly, but sometimes it reverses direction. In Iran, the calendar seems to be turning backward, echoing scenes from nearly half a century ago. In 1979, an exhausted monarch departed Tehran as crowds watched, uncertain what would follow. Days later, a cleric returned from exile, promising dignity, justice, and independence. Today, the symmetry is unsettling. Once again, rumors swirl of leaders preparing exits. Once again, the idea of exile hangs over the capital like a familiar ghost. This time, however, the roles appear inverted. The revolutionary generation that once claimed to represent the oppressed now faces accusations of becoming what it overthrew. Allegations that Ali Khamenei might seek refuge abroad, reports even hinting at Moscow as a contingency, carry enormous symbolic weight. Whether true or exaggerated, the effect is the same: they plant doubt. A leader perceived as immovable is suddenly imagined in transit. In authoritarian systems, imagination alone can be destabilizing. The comparison to 1979 sharpens when another name resurfaces in public discourse: Reza Pahlavi. For decades, he existed on the margins of Iranian politics, a relic of a past officially condemned and publicly forgotten. Now his statements circulate widely, not as royal nostalgia, but as an alternative vocabulary of national identity. Calls for unity, secular governance, and alignment with global norms resonate in a society exhausted by isolation. Importantly, this resurgence does not necessarily signal a widespread desire to restore monarchy. The chants echoing through some protests are less about lineage than about contrast. They reflect a rejection of clerical rule more than an embrace of royal rule. In that sense, Reza Pahlavi functions less as a claimant and more as a symbol, a reminder that Iran once imagined a different trajectory, one interrupted but not erased. The historical irony is sharp. In 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi left Iran amid accusations of repression and foreign dependence. The clerical establishment promised moral governance and national sovereignty. Decades later, critics argue that the system born from that revolution has replicated many of the same flaws: centralized power, economic inequality, and political exclusion, while adding new layers of ideological control. Globally, observers recognize this pattern. Revolutions often devour their legitimacy over time, especially when founding myths harden into dogma. From Eastern Europe to the Arab world, regimes born in upheaval frequently struggle to adapt once revolutionary energy fades. Iran's current moment fits that arc: a state still armed and organized, but ideologically tired. The danger for the regime lies not in the existence of an alternative figure, but in the vacuum created when the present loses credibility. When leadership appears temporary, history rushes in to offer substitutes real or imagined. That process accelerates elite defections, encourages security hesitations, and reframes protests as destiny rather than dissent. Iran now stands at a crossroads where memory and momentum collide. The past is no longer buried, it is being reinterpreted in real time, and as history presses forward from behind, the regime must confront a chilling possibility that the story it once wrote may now be writing its ending instead. Revolutions are often narrated through slogans and symbols, but they are sustained by something far more basic: empty shelves. In Iran, the most potent accelerant of unrest is no longer ideology, it is hunger. Inflation has stripped wages of meaning. Ordinary food items have become markers of inequality. Eggs, rice, tomatoes, once mundane, are now charged with political significance. When survival itself feels negotiable, loyalty evaporates. Scenes from provincial towns capture this shift with brutal clarity. Crowds storm supermarkets linked to regime-affiliated networks, not to loot discreetly, but to make a statement. Bags of rice are torn open and scattered across floors. This is not theft, it is rejection, a refusal to accept a system that hoards abundance for insiders while offering symbolic aid to everyone else. Economists note that such acts signal a crisis of legitimacy, not merely a spike in prices. The economic collapse has also fueled a silent exodus. Iran's most educated and mobile citizens, doctors, engineers, IT specialists are leaving in record numbers. Neighboring hubs like Yerevan and Dubai have become launchpads for talent-seeking stability. Europe absorbs medical professionals. The Gulf absorbs coders and analysts. This brain drain compounds the crisis as the economy weakens the people needed to fix it, depart, accelerating decline. Data from academic and migration studies paint a stark picture. Millions have left in recent years, and a majority express no intention of returning under current conditions. The state responds with restrictions and rhetoric, but cannot reverse the underlying calculus. When opportunity is external and repression internal, the rational choice is exit. Every departing professional represents not just lost labor, but lost faith. The human cost is inseparable from repression. Memories of the women life freedom movement remain fresh, galvanized by the death of Mahsa Amini. Hundreds were killed, thousands detained. The lesson absorbed by society was grim but clear. Peaceful protest carries lethal risk, yet silence carries permanent loss. That tension now defines daily life. Globally, analysts draw parallels. Ukraine's resistance showed how economic resilience under fire can sustain national will. Israel's internal debates reveal how security pressure reshapes civil liberties. US-China competition underscores how economic leverage becomes strategic weaponry. Iran sits at the intersection of these trends, sanctioned, surveilled, and strategically isolated, while its population bears the cost. Washington watches closely. With Donald Trump back in the White House, US rhetoric emphasizes pressure deterrence and prestige. Yet the Iranian crisis exposes a deeper dilemma for global powers. Sanctions can weaken regimes, but they also squeeze societies. When hardship turns systemic, unrest becomes unpredictable and contagious. What makes this moment volatile is the convergence of deprivation and defiance. Hunger erodes fear faster than slogans ever could. Families choosing between food and dignity begin to see resistance as necessity, not ideology, and when survival itself becomes political compromise, narrows to zero. As Iran's economy tightens like a vice, the streets ask a question no regime can ignore forever: if the state cannot feed its people or protect their future, what claim does it have to obedience? Power ultimately rests on those who carry weapons and on whether they believe in the orders they receive. In Iran, that equation is wobbling. As political elites hedge and symbols fall, the country's security architecture faces its most consequential test in decades. The question is no longer whether protests can be dispersed, but whether the chain of command can still function when trust has begun to fracture. At the center of this dilemma stands the security bureaucracy, the regular army, and the Revolutionary Guards. Their cohesion has long been the regime's ultimate insurance policy, yet signs of strain are increasingly visible. Reports of abandoned police stations, selective withdrawals, and officers blending into civilian crowds suggest not a coordinated mutiny, but something potentially more dangerous: hesitation. In coercive systems, hesitation spreads faster than rebellion. The divide between senior commanders and lower-ranking personnel is widening. Top generals long embedded in patronage networks have benefited from the system's economic privileges. Rank-and-file soldiers have not. Their families queue for basic goods. Salaries lag behind inflation. When rumors circulate that political leaders are preparing escape routes, the moral contract collapses. No soldier wants to be the last defender of a regime already planning its exit. Historically, such moments produce two outcomes. Either the security forces consolidate power in a last-ditch attempt to preserve order, or they fragment, choosing neutrality, regional autonomy, or alignment with the population. Iran's history offers a precedent. In 1979, the army's refusal to fully suppress protests accelerated the Shah's fall. Today, analysts note a similar risk of institutional drift, especially if orders grow contradictory or leadership visibility declines. The strategic implications extend far beyond Iran. Regional stability hinges on the behavior of armed actors during internal crises. In Ukraine, the loyalty of military units proved decisive in resisting invasion. In the Middle East, state collapse has repeatedly shown how armed fragmentation fuels long-term instability. For Washington, Beijing, and Moscow alike, Iran's trajectory is a test case for how pressure, prestige, and restraint interact in a multipolar world. International attention is intense. Global powers prepare for contingencies ranging from refugee flows to shifts in regional deterrence. Yet none can determine the outcome. That power lies with institutions on the ground and with individuals deciding whether to obey, delay, or refuse. For ordinary Iranians, this is the final unknown. Protesters sense that history is moving, but history does not move alone. It requires choices made quietly in barracks and command rooms. If the armed forces fracture, the regime's survival window narrows rapidly. If they hold together, repression may yet prevail at a cost that reshapes the state itself. This is the moment where timing eclipses ideology. Suitcases may be packed in palaces, but the decisive action will come from those with rifles and radios. Will they defend a system losing faith in itself, or step aside as society demands a new contract? The answer will determine not only Iran's future, but the balance between security and freedom across a region already on edge. And as the world watches, one question lingers: when the order comes, who will still be willing to carry it out? Iran stands at a critical inflection point where internal fractures, economic collapse, and elite uncertainty converge. What began as widespread protests has evolved into a systemic crisis marked by clerical dissent, symbolic defiance, and reports of ruling families seeking escape abroad. These developments have eroded the regime's ideological and psychological control, leaving authority increasingly reliant on force alone. History's shadow looms large. Parallels with 1979 underscore the danger of leadership perceived as temporary and disconnected from public suffering. The resurfacing of alternative political narratives reflects not nostalgia, but exhaustion with clerical rule. Meanwhile, hunger and inflation have transformed daily life into a political battlefield, accelerating unrest and driving a devastating brain drain. The decisive variable is the security apparatus. As trust frays between political elites and rank-and-file forces, hesitation replaces certainty. In such moments, outcomes hinge not on crowd size or slogans, but on whether soldiers obey, delay, or refuse. This choice will shape Iran's trajectory and its regional impact. For global powers, the crisis tests assumptions about pressure, prestige, and stability. For Iranians, it is a struggle over dignity, survival, and the future of the state. The clocks are ticking in Tehran. The question is not if change is coming, but how and at what cost.